So thank you everyone for coming today. Welcome to today's webinar. It is a mouthful on the screen, as you can see. Today, we're talking about strategies for equitable grant making and philanthropy, and we're featuring the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group. So we're really happy to have them here today, and it'll be a great conversation. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, I'm Yvonne Sims, Educational Programming Manager, and I'm based in Atlanta. And if you don't know Candid quite yet, this might be a new webinar for you. We are the coming together of Foundation Center and GuideStar. In 2019, these two organizations came together, and together they have over 90 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. So every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars, and Candid finds out where that money goes, where it comes from, and why it matters. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. And we do that through many of our community partners where you can find out tools. We do it through training, and we do it through webinars like the ones we're having today. All right, this is the good part. So we're getting to our speakers today, and there they are on the screen. I'm going to read a little bit about them in their bios, but I'm also going to share a survey. So I'm going to multitask. I'm doing a lot today, y'all. I deserve, I don't know, a raise or something. Okay, here we go. I'm going to launch this poll so we can see who's here. And while we're answering the poll, I'll let you know that we have Corey Anderson here with us today. Corey is a relentless collaborator. He builds and maintains local and national partnerships, launches bold initiatives, and strategizes to ensure the foundation pursues equity for all Arkansans. I learned that today. In addition to his role at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, Corey also serves as the interim executive director of Forward Arkansas. Corey understands collaboration because it has been his career. David Moras, founder and president of Marga Incorporated, PhD, is the founder and president of Marga Incorporated, a consulting firm founded in 2000, providing strategic advice and research to philanthropic initiatives and community partnerships. Dr. Moras has held faculty positions at Yale University and Columbia University. He was a senior program advisor at the Rockefeller Foundation. And then we have Sharmila Lawrence, who serves as the Executive Vice President of Marga Incorporated. She previously worked at the National Center for Children in Poverty at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, and her past research has focused on issues related to early childhood development, child and family well-being, and domestic violence. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University with a dual concentration in economic and political development and human rights and humanitarian affairs. And thank you for answering our poll. So we're so glad to have them here representing their organization. And we also wanted to know who was in the room. So our question was, who's here today? I work at a foundation. I work at a nonprofit. I'm on the board of a foundation. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, or I work at a non-grant making philanthropy serving org or other. Ooh, I'm really multitasking because you're telling me. I see we have Commission of the Arts, Humanities, Government, a grant making org. I work at Arts and Culture nonprofit. Okay, so we have nonprofit folks in here. So we have about 84%. So I'm going to close it so that we can get started. I'm going to share. So it looks like most of our audience, 62%, work at a nonprofit. We have 19% at a foundation, and then smaller percentages that are on boards or PSOs. So I'm going to stop sharing this and let our speakers take over. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Yvonne. Apologies, my camera is not working at this moment. So you'll hear from me, and then you'll hear from Sharmila for a bit, and then me again, then Sharmila, and back to Corey, and back to Sharmila. So we're going to tag team, and we're going to go a little back and forth. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. So thank you very much for being willing to participate and hear from us about the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group and some of our work. And one of the things that's good about what we have here today is we have Sharmila and I representing Marga Incorporated, which houses the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group. And then we have our longest standing member of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, in Corey Anderson. So we want to make sure that you get the balanced perspective of those of us who are coordinating and managing the work of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, as well as one of our members. So hopefully that will give you a rounded point of view. Thank you so much again, Yvonne. I appreciate the survey and understanding who is in the room and who is listening. I want to make sure that we can adapt as much as possible to our audience and your needs. Obviously, if most of you are nonprofits, thinking from a perspective of engaging with foundations and raising money from foundations, I myself, one thing that wasn't in my bio is that I was on the fundraising side before I got to the giving side in philanthropy. And it was always important to understand some of the inner workings and priorities of foundations. And so for us, with an organization like the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, really trying to transform foundations' commitment to racial equity and other aspects of equity and inclusion, which ultimately I think has a real influence in terms of how foundations interact with nonprofit organizations, as well as the constituents they're served, and also in terms of how they develop grant-making strategies. And so as we talk about the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, you will hear that our approach is not solely on grant making in terms of the role of foundations. We really look at transforming the total foundation in terms of its policies and practices and commitments to these particular principles. And we think that ultimately has an influence in terms of how foundations connect with grantees and nonprofit organizations. You will hear at some point in our presentation, Sharmila talking about our work on power sharing. So we focus a lot of our emphasis, particularly in our more recent years, on the level of collaboration and engagement and trust between foundations and nonprofit organizations, which we think is also really crucial in terms of making those kinds of connections that offer grantee organizations and nonprofits in general opportunities with foundations that are, on the one hand, about grant making, and then on the other hand, other ways in which relationships with foundations can open up opportunities. I know for myself, I've always thought of foundations as potential partners, not just people who can give money, but people who can open doors to other resources, people who can be influential in terms of information about a particular field of interest in which you're working. So there are lots of opportunities in terms of building those partnerships. But we need foundations who are committed to the principles around racial equity and other aspects of race and equity, other aspects of equity and inclusion. And it has a huge influence in terms of their role in the nonprofit sector as a whole. So Marga Incorporated is a consulting firm, as Yvonne mentioned in the introduction, which provides strategic advice and research to philanthropic initiatives and community partnerships. I started Marga Incorporated back in 2000, really on the heels of work that I was doing at the Rockefeller Foundation. The consulting firm in itself, in many ways, was built based on different relationships with foundations that emerged while I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. And one of those important relationships was with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. When I was at Rockefeller, I was working on a portfolio called Building Community, and it was looking at what we were calling comprehensive community development initiatives back in the late 1990s. And there were many grantees that we had in common with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So I got to know a whole cluster of different people at Annie E. Casey and began to learn about some of the emerging commitments that they were developing at that foundation as it related to various aspects of racial equity and DEI. They commissioned a study, which I'll talk a little bit more about going forward, which was one of the early projects for Marga Incorporated, where I personally interviewed about 30 different foundation representatives from across the country to hear their perspectives and to understand more about their programs and initiatives as it related to racial equity and various aspects of what we would now call DEI. It wasn't the terminology we were using back then. And ultimately, as a part of that study, there were many foundations who wanted to get the information that the Annie E. Casey Foundation was commissioning for themselves. And that ultimately led to the creation of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, which brings together foundations who are really committed to their ability to promoting racial equity and inclusion in their policies and practices and systems and operations. We lead with race. We don't focus 100% on race in our work, although it's heavily mostly on race. But we decided at the point when, because the point in history when the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group was created, there wasn't as much attention to race specifically in philanthropy, and there was probably more conversation about diversity generally. And one of the things that we realized in our experiences was that a focus on diversity sometimes led to race gradually falling out of the conversation. Race being considered one of the more difficult conversations that a number of people didn't actually want to grapple with. And so we thought it was important to lead with race in this particular work, understanding the significance of the history of racial inequality, but also understanding the correlation between so many of the types of programs that foundations work on and racial equity. So if a foundation has programs on education, on things related to poverty, on things related to climate and the environment, on a whole host of issues, having a racial equity lens is crucial to the ability to being able to do that work effectively and reach the populations that are most challenged when they are confronted with those particular issues, such as education as a real kind of stark example. And now fast forwarding to the future, what has happened is that this original group of about 6 or 7 foundations that came together to periodically meet and have conversations about priority issues facing foundations as it relates to racial equity and other aspects of equity and inclusion has grown over the years. And so now the core membership, and we emphasize that terminology core intentionally because there are core members of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, and then there are many, many others who we call affiliate members of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group. So the core members of REPG really drive REPG's work, which is on the one hand about strengthening the work and the policies and practices of the foundations who are in the core membership. And then on the other, it is also about influencing the broader philanthropic field. Therefore, one of the things that we have done more recently is we have taken the learning exchange framework that we use in REPG meetings among the core members and packaged it in a way that we can bring that learning exchange framework to other clusters of foundations. So we host numerous different sessions with other groups of foundations by way of partnerships with philanthropy serving organizations, which I'll talk about a little further on. So we can go to the next slide. And so just to give you a feel for who's in the core membership, and I know upon sight, this looks like a real mixed bag of different types of foundations, really of all shapes and sizes, and that is in many ways by design. One of the things that was very clear in the original conversations toward creating REPG was that there is learning that is useful for all types of foundations. There are experiences that very small foundations have in their work that can be very influential in terms of how very large foundations approach their work, and vice versa. So we wanted to create a cluster of core members who would be in some ways representative of a wide range of different types of foundations. And we're still working on that. We're still working to continue to grow our core membership and make sure that we are representative of a range of types of foundations, because we know the experiences on the one hand can be similar, but we also know that they can be very different. The experiences of a community foundation have some very particular dimensions when it comes to racial equity and when it comes to creating a racial equity culture inside of an organization and all the different constituencies who you have to bring on board and the complexities of donors and donor advised funds and all of that. And a family foundation is also going to have some real particular realities in terms of how a foundation and its work relates to a family who may be the entire board is made up of family members in some instances, in most instances in family foundations, and yet this is the largest constituency of foundations that we have in existence. So important to really understand that point of view, and of course those very large foundations, and we have a number of them in the group as well, what they're able to do with their resources and the learning that comes from their experiences is crucial as well. So we're continuing to build on this. We want to bring in more corporate foundation members, as this is a constituency that we haven't had significantly represented. So we're building this as we continue to go. So we continue to engage our core members who meet periodically during the year. And those meetings are learning exchanges among those members, but also they really operate as think tanks in the sense that there is a lot of strategic thinking that comes out of those conversations that shapes a number of different plans and initiatives that we pursue to influence the broader philanthropic field. And one of the things we also try to make sure to do is to collect the knowledge that is coming from the experiences of our core member foundations and share them in different capacities. That could be in the form of case examples, written case examples. We're going to be distributing a paper on power sharing later this year with a number of specific case examples of experiences of foundations as it relates to power sharing. It could also be in the instance of speaking engagements, like we have Corey Anderson, our esteemed veteran REPG member, sharing with us today. And we have leveraged speaking engagements among many of our members in our sessions with other clusters of foundations through our partnerships with philanthropy serving organizations. We can go to the next slide. Just to give you a quick history in terms of the evolution of REPG, and the contexts are really important here. So the Annie E. Casey Foundation, I mentioned before, I had met a number of program staff and managers at the Annie E. Casey Foundation when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. I was always impressed with the folks who were there. I found that the staff at Annie E. Casey was more diverse than the staff that I was encountering at other foundations, other large foundations. And one of the things that was also interesting about Annie E. Casey is that they had a group which exists to this very day, an internal group called Respect. And Respect was a way of bringing together, and Corey was once at the Annie E. Casey Foundation and in Respect, so you may want to share that experience later on. That Respect was a way of bringing together people at all levels in the foundation to really talk about issues as it relates to race, racial equity, racial justice, diversity, inclusion, and they had internal learning opportunities. But one day I was contacted, and many of the members are from Respect are well known in philanthropy today. So Susan Batten, for example, who is the head of ABFI. There are numerous other people who were involved in Respect at the Annie E. Casey Foundation who went on to be very influential in philanthropy. And there was a cluster of folks from Respect who contacted me, and Marga Incorporated was just a fledgling idea at this point in time, and asked me to do these interviews of foundations. And the reason they said they wanted to do interviews of other foundations is because they wanted to know how other foundations were approaching these issues in their work as a way of influencing the senior management at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, because the idea was that while Respect existed as a discussion group in the foundation, the entire foundation had not truly transformed in its commitment to racial equity and various aspects of DEI, and it had not transformed at the levels of management. So the idea was also that if the senior management of the foundation could see the work that other foundations were doing as it relates to this work, that they would then feel more comfortable exploring new policies and practices in their foundation. So many of us may have experienced and may know in our reality that foundations often learn very well from other foundations. And that's a fundamental component in terms of why the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group was created. And in fact, it was true that we finished this study, and the practices and the policies that were emerging out of that research were influential in terms of how the senior management of the foundation responded. So there was a priority group on equity that was created by the senior management of the foundation. The person I mentioned before, Susan Batten, she became a representative on that senior management team and really kind of played this, and we see this more in foundations now. It's much more common than it was 20 years ago, where you have someone who has a designated position focusing specifically on racial equity or DEI. And there's a lot of conversation about, how influential those positions can be. Some of that has to do with where they're situated inside of the foundation. So fast forward, we developed this Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, a small group of foundations who were participating in this original study, wanted to come together, talk to each other, and as I mentioned before, really wanted to focus on the whole foundation. One of the things that was a finding from this study was that there might have been some foundations that had, say, a grant-making program on racial justice or racial equity or on diversity or something of that sort, but we saw far fewer examples of foundations that really were focused on a total commitment, that made it a strategic priority for the foundation as a whole. And that's really what we've been aiming for throughout the existence of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, to kind of create that space where people could have a learning exchange, share ideas with each other, and different foundations taking back ideas that they have learned from peers, really toward this aim of having this kind of comprehensive commitment as a whole inside of their foundations. We can go to the next phase. And as we just continued to evolve developing the learning exchange method that really was based on the premise that learning exchange is not just conversation for its sake, that learning exchange in this particular format was really designed to influence institutional change based on that original example with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And so this whole method of learning exchange was really designed around that. And then our periodic meetings with core members increasingly took on specific topics or themes as it relates to this broad, really universe, because every dimension of a foundation should be interrogated as it relates to this work. So how do you break that down? And so we would have different conversations on various aspects of that. And so in the broader context of philanthropy at that time, we did see some increasing dialogue on the need to diversify staff, to diversify management in philanthropy. We saw the emergence of the Diversity in Philanthropy Project, which evolved into the D5 Coalition at that time. And then certainly we've seen some progress. As you can see, there's a data point there on that slide. There's certainly been some progress on composition and representation, which we think is absolutely important and remains important, but it's not the only thing as it relates to transforming a foundation to the point where it really is more comprehensively changed and transformed. We can go to the next slide. And our more recent stage of development is sort of as our membership expanded, there was so much going on in the broader context of the time, which influenced expansion in our membership, many more inquiring with us directly about how to join and become a part of the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group. We also became much more intentional about how we work with and influence the broader field. So whereas in the earlier stages, we were really focused on reports and presentations like this one only, we didn't have an additional arm of influencing the field, which was a way of taking this learning exchange framework and bringing it to other clusters of foundations. And that really was the key part of this, is that we could work with, and we were very fortunate to, once we created the framework in a way that could be digested by other groups, we were fortunate to be able to test it out with Philanthropy New York, of a regional philanthropy serving organization, with a group in Chicago called the Cross-Funder Racial Equity Collaborative, which was made up of different foundations that had each experienced training from APFI on racial equity, and then wanted to figure out a way to take the ideas that they were discussing in trainings and put them into practice. And so this group had come together, and so they were testing out this learning exchange with us, and we were sort of helping them grow in the process as well. And Philanthropy Southeast was another one where we tested it. And then we developed a partnership with the United Philanthropy Forum, which many of you know is the association of associations. So all of those philanthropy serving organizations that are out there, whether they're regional associations or issue-based associations or population-focused associations, are members of the United Philanthropy Forum. And so they had already been a client of Marga Incorporated. We were working with the forum on building up their racial equity work. And in the engagement that we experienced with them, we saw parallels in terms of how the philanthropy serving organizations were also being influenced by different occurrences in the field and in society, what was going on in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of uh, uh, Ferguson. There was so much influence that was creating a next level of curiosity and interest among foundations. And because the foundations are members of the philanthropy serving organizations, the philanthropy serving organizations were asking for more information from the United Philanthropy Forum. So our relationship with the United Philanthropy Forum opened up an opportunity for us to talk to them about testing out the next level of our racial equity framework, or learning exchange framework, with some of their philanthropy serving organization members. So over the last few years, we have been organizing clusters of 8-ish foundations by way of partnerships with different philanthropy serving organizations and taking them through a series of learning exchanges. The other thing that's characteristic of the times that we are in the present, is that while on the one hand, especially feeling 2020, 2021, this real upswing in interest. People who had maybe never even really talked about racial equity before, suddenly making statements or making promises about work they can do, and having interest in expanding their work on racial equity. And then, of course, in very recent years, we've seen a real backlash to the work. And we've seen large-scale events, like the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, that are influencing how people talk about and think about developing programs, policies, creating positions that focus specifically on racial equity or DEI. So we're having to really think about what that means for us, which I'll talk about later. And then within REPG, as I mentioned before, and Sharmila will talk about this, we've been really exploring power sharing. We have seen really as a next level of conversation for us in terms of what this means. We've talked about a lot of policies and practices and foundations over the years. And now we're like, what does that mean as it relates to communities of color? What does that mean as it relates to organizations that are working on racial justice and the relationships that they have with foundations? So now we can go to the next slide, and I will pass it to Sharmila.
Thanks, David. And welcome, everybody. Glad to be here. So as David noted, when REPG first began, a lot of the conversations were primarily focused on topics such as demographics, data collection, board strategy, etc. But in 2015 and 2016, REPG saw an increase in its membership, partly due to the Ferguson unrest, the Black Lives Matter movement, also a result of the 2016 election. And then in 2020, there was a substantial increase in membership. And around this time, the nature of the discussions also changed, with an increase in conversations about how to decolonize wealth. And part of that was also fueled by Edgar Villanova's book by the same name, Decolonizing Wealth. And there was a real focus on how foundations could share power with communities. So REPG member foundations really recognize that in order to transcend traditional philanthropic practice, where foundations are seen as the experts and communities are just seen as recipients for grants, that to transform that, it really requires operating with a recognition that community members are the ones with the expertise and should be involved in the decisions around who and what gets funded. And so this requires, being in communities, so being proximate to communities, listening deeply to community members and voices, valuing lived expertise, lived experience as expertise, and really sharing decision-making power with communities in order to truly embody racial equity values. And so based on these discussions, REPG created a power sharing task force that was comprised of several members of REPG, several member foundations of REPG. And we developed an open letter to philanthropy, just reflecting on the importance of advancing a commitment to power sharing, along with volume 1 of a power sharing framework that categorizes various approaches and practices to power sharing. And both of these pieces were featured in a Chronicle of Philanthropy and an Inside Philanthropy article. And we have links to those here in our slides, but they're also available on the Margo website, which we can share we've shared the link for that at the end of this webinar. And then a second volume of the power sharing framework is in development. And I think David mentioned this as well. It'll feature 10 case summaries of how various REPG and non-REPG foundations are engaging in power sharing within the areas of trust-based philanthropy, participatory grant making, and community-driven philanthropy. And that paper will be released later this year. So then just transitioning a little bit to share some context about the current landscape in philanthropy and what we are seeing as it relates to racial equity and the DEI backlash, before I turn it back to David, who will share more about how REPG is responding in this current climate. So as we all know, after COVID and the racial uprisings following the death of George Floyd in 2020, there was a substantial expansion of commitments to DEI and particularly racial equity and inclusion within philanthropy. And then by 2022, we really started to see the backlash with a coordinated attack on many fronts. So we're seeing it in higher education, within government, in corporations, and now in philanthropy as well. And so in recent years, we've seen a wide range of legislation that's been passed, including related to the banning of books, limiting discussion about racism and sexism and gender identity in schools. We've seen voter suppression bills, partly in response to the high voter turnout of people of color in the 2020 election. There's been an increase in anti-abortion bills in response to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There's also just been a plethora of anti-DEI education bills most recently. There's anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans bills. And of course, the ending of affirmative action and now the attacks on grant programs, which the Fearless Fund is an example of this, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. And so between September to November 2023, the Center for Effective Philanthropy surveyed about 280 foundations to see how they were responding to the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision. And they found that at that time, more than half of the foundations were planning to have internal discussions about the implications of the ruling on their work, though few were planning to make any changes at that time. However, when we fast forward to this year, 2024, there was a CEP report on the state of nonprofits in 2024, and they found that 40% of nonprofit leaders surveyed said that racial equity commitments from funders were continuing. However, 36% reported that current funders have either made no commitments or have reduced or ended their commitments in the last year. So clearly, we are seeing some retrenchment in philanthropy in response to the current backlash. And while currently there's no study that's really examined how the attacks on DEI are impacting foundations and their grant making programs specifically. A recent Chronicle of Philanthropy article did note some trends, and one is that the attacks are having a chilling effect on funders, with some foundations removing or changing language on their website or applications so that they're less explicit about race. So, for example, discussing the achievement gap rather than talking about educational equity. And then some larger foundations feel that they can afford the legal exposure and that they are willing to, stand firm in supporting justice and equity during this time. And so some foundations are setting up legal defense funds for their grantees to help them navigate these challenges. So the Black Freedom Fund is an example of this. And then some philanthropic advisors are just urging foundations to recognize that their work is really an expression of their values, and that it's important to stand by those values even in difficult and challenging times. But the legal challenges do come at a price, and we can see that with the Fearless Fund case. So just to provide a little bit of background, a lawsuit was filed by the American Alliance for Equal Rights, alleging that one of the Fearless Fund's grant programs, which awarded grants to Black women-owned small businesses, was violating a federal statute that was enacted as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1886 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race in the making or enforcing of contracts. And so the Fearless Fund reached a settlement on September 10th and agreed to end its Fearless Strivers Grant Contest, which was the grant program that was in question. And so a recent Council on Foundations and Independent Sector webinar highlighted some of the implications of that settlement. And one of the things that they noted is that the immediate impact is that it cost the foundation a lot of time, money, and attention, and it ultimately disrupted the work, which was sort of the intended effect. However, they noted that foundations that are kind of looking at this case should navigate these challenges by, one, staying informed and recognizing that the decision in this case is not applicable to every grant program. And in fact, the Fearless Fund settled in order to avoid having the case go to the Supreme Court, and possibly setting a precedent, which would have more far-reaching implications. And so the decision only really applies to Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And these all fall under the 11th Circuit Court. These states fall under the 11th Circuit Court. So if foundations, they made the point that if foundations are shutting down their programs preemptively, then they're really doing the job for those that are trying to challenge these programs. And so foundations should instead ensure that their grant-related communications do not establish a contract or use contractual language, since the federal statute prohibits discrimination on the basis of race in contracts, and that agreements should note that grant recipients will not be providing any service to the foundation in return for the grant, which would sort of make it seem like it's a contract if that language is included. And they also note that this case does not apply to every program that serves underrepresented populations. So there are ways to frame the issues to avoid clear positive discrimination. So, for example, not having race be an eligibility criteria, but focusing on geographic location or income level or other proxies. So another point that they made is that providing unrestricted funding by its nature is less likely to be seen as contractual. And that, so in this regard, I guess embracing trust-based philanthropy approaches could really be helpful in avoiding some of these legal ramifications. And finally, they noted that it's important to ensure that boards are really included in the conversation and that the work is being framed as part of the overall mission of the organization. So there are ways that foundations can avoid this chilling effect and continue the work. And now I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk about how REPG is responding to this changing climate.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. One of the first things that we did when we started hearing about what was going on, and we always have situations where we're having conversations individually with our different members and talking about things, additional things that we can do. So in a conversation with the Annie Casey Foundation, they were sharing some of their experiences in terms of what they were hearing from some of the southern states in which they have been working, and they were very concerned about how different organizations were going to be able to respond to some of the local policies that they were seeing. So they actually commissioned a study. Unfortunately, this is not a public study. I know we're sharing a lot of our resources. This is one that never went public. And so we'd have to make a special request to the foundation to show it to any particular individual. So that's something folks will have to follow up with Sharmila about if you want. But we had some really important findings coming out of that study, just in terms of the range of approaches, just about anything you can imagine in terms of foundations who are deciding to just not really directly address it, some who are deciding to maybe fund more in advocacy, some who are deciding to try to do more and potentially even double down on their levels of commitment. We, of course, have not heard as much in terms of foundations that are perhaps entirely concerned about moving forward with their work on racial equity. And so that is interesting in itself. So we do have this study that we conducted, which was interesting. It was at an early stage when we started to see things bubbling up, particularly at state levels, with a real hostile reaction to so much of the progress that has been made. So we are continually monitoring what's happening in different communities. And then Corey may want to share more about this. We partnered with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation to organize a convening really on foundations in the South, which we held in Atlanta back in February, and it was called Advancing Equity Through Philanthropic Strategy in Polarized Times. And so this approach to conversation is something that we want to bring to multiple different communities across the country. We had about 20 participants in this discussion, a combination of representatives of foundations as well as philanthropy serving organizations. And what we did was kind of a two-pronged meeting where one part of the meeting was specifically focused on our learning exchange method. And so what we did is we heard from the different foundations represented about their experiences. What are they seeing? These are foundations from various parts of the South. What are they seeing? How are they responding? What is their thinking about moving forward as it relates to this work? And then what we also did is we had a strategic conversation about the future that really looked philanthropy-wide. What does philanthropy really need to do in terms of responding in this particular context? Out of that conversation came a statement, which we then put on our site. It's on our site. And then we also shared it with Inside Philanthropy, which built an article around this particular statement. And I'll say a little bit more about what was in this particular statement. The other thing that we did within REPG is we created a political and social context task force. So as you heard from Sharmila, we have a task force on power sharing. So we create small subgroups from the core membership to really talk through and strategize around particular themes that need further attention. And so this particular task force is helping us think through what are some of the next steps for us to take in terms of spreading this, advancing equity, discussion series to different parts of the country and building on whatever other strategies we might develop in this regard going forward. We can go to the next slide. And talking about the different responses, just want to acknowledge some of the factors that come into play in terms of foundations responding to what's going on in the different contexts right now. And we have to realize this just in terms of our own core membership, that if you're in California, there's a certain experience that you have as it relates to this work right now. If you're in Arkansas, and Corey's experience in Winthrop Rockefeller, it's a different kind of reality. And so how do foundations navigate the geographic context of their reality? If you're in a particular field, obviously a field like higher education as an example that is directly tied to the affirmative action decision, that's going to affect to a certain degree how you go about responding as a foundation in this context. The type of foundation, as I mentioned earlier, community foundations, family foundations, corporate foundations have different types of reactions to this kind of work. And of course, our concern going forward is really how do you maintain the momentum that we have been building over the last several years? How do we, as we saw more foundations developing commitments to racial equity, how do we keep that going and build that over time? And that really speaks to the length of time doing this work. We've seen so many foundations that were really, really new to this work coming on board in 2020 and 2021. And just wondering how tenuous are those levels of commitment in the face of increased hostilities in a societal context. And we'll go to the next slide. And I mentioned the statement. This gives you a feel for some of the ideas that came out of that statement. And so a significant part of our conversation was about, in philanthropy, if we are committed to advancing racial equity and equity broadly, where are we heading? What's the North Star? Or is our North Star to really build and continue to strengthen a multiracial democracy? It sounds like a simple concept, but obviously there are many people who don't really want to go in that direction. And there is clearly activity from a policy perspective and on multiple levels that are in some way going against that direction. But we really haven't had a coordinated strategy in philanthropy to move at this kind of level. So how could we then develop the kind of collaboration that we need across philanthropy to take on some of these particular issues? And I go down to the second to last bullet there, move funding closer to communities, which I think is relevant for our conversation today, which is also crucial because there's so much that happens at the local level where these issues can be challenged. And there's so many organizations working at the local level that may not have access to larger grants that exist at the national level. So how do we build and deepen more partnerships that open up those flows across large scale philanthropy nationally to the ground levels? Let's just go to the next slide because I'm watching our time. And just going forward and thinking about that level of collaboration and building that collaboration over time, it is so important just to look back at this notion I mentioned earlier in terms of the philanthropy serving organizations, because the philanthropy serving organizations touch multiple thousands of foundations. And so how do we build those partnerships from our point of view as Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group, a small group of foundations with a big and broad mission and purpose? How do we contribute to the broader landscape of transformative work that really continues to grow and strengthen philanthropic commitments to racial equity and other aspects of equity and inclusion? And that really does require partnerships with philanthropy serving organizations. So we are continuing to build those partnerships, and ABFI, as I mentioned before, has been an important partner for us over the years. And I also mentioned the United Philanthropy Forum, with the breadth of its membership, is actually absolutely crucial going forward. We can go to the next slide. And I will turn it to Corey.
Sure. Thank you, David. So maybe where I'll start is just a little bit more framing of how the participants in this call can use the information that we're sharing. So, and you all will have to help me because I'm going to use a church metaphor, and because I'm using church metaphors, I'll probably need you to respond or react just so I know that you're getting the metaphor. So if this lands for you, if you could use the thumbs up or the heart emoji or whatever for me, that would be helpful. But there's a tradition, and it's actually not just in the Black church, it's actually in many churches, that's called hymn raising. So HYMN, hymn raising. And it still happens in churches, but it happened particularly like at the early turn of the century when there were a lot of folks in church that were still illiterate before literacy was a thing. So they couldn't read the hymn manuals. And what would happen in the church is the person that actually could read the hymn manuals or knew the song, they would say the first line of the song, and then the congregation would repeat that line. So it was a way for people to participate, like even if they didn't know the whole song. So I think part of my framing before I get into the little bit of what I'm going to talk about our foundation is that a lot of what you've heard here today already, the resources that David has shared, the work that he's talked about the work that we're doing in big progressive philanthropy, and that's my word for it. Even if you don't know all of it, even if it all is not like totally making sense to you, you can share it. So like we've raised the hymn. So this is maybe the first, the second, and we've probably given you 10 or 15 lines that you can just repeat in the places that you are, and in particular for the nonprofit folks that are on the call with your funders. One of the things that I've learned about philanthropy, and like David and like a lot of y'all, like I spent about a decade in nonprofit, and then I've spent about 20 years in philanthropy. But one of the things that I know about philanthropy is that it doesn't change unless it hears things multiple times. And I'm talking about particularly philanthropy sort of writ large, but particularly big philanthropy. So the more the foundations that you're working with, and for the foundations that are on here in terms of staff, like the more your leadership and the board, like here's these things that other foundations are doing, the more likely they are to begin moving in the directions that we're talking about. So, case in point, I'm Corey. I work at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I call us the Little Rockefeller Foundation because we're a small one. We're in Arkansas and we're in Little Rock, but that's just to distinguish us from the other big Rockefeller foundations that are out there. Our mission, and we've just sort of reaffirmed this, is a relentless pursuit of economic, educational, social, ethnic, and racial equity for all Arkansans. So we take everything, like all of the types of equity that you could pursue, even in this time where equity itself has become, as David talked about, a bit of a bad word. We're wrapping our arms, and have been for the last 50 years, technically, but certainly for the last 5 years, have been wrapping our arms around this idea of equity. And we believe that you have to get to equity in order to get to the vision, which is a thriving and prosperous Arkansas that benefits everyone. I see at least one of our former board members on here, Dr. Murphy Irby, and she's one of the folks that actually helped set the stage that got us to this mission 5 years ago. Just for clarity purposes, when we talk about equity as a goal in Arkansas or in anywhere, what we mean is that when you disaggregate data by race, place, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, but when you disaggregate data, that you can no longer tell who's who, meaning outcomes, positive, negative, and neutral, are equitably distributed across race, place, gender, sexual orientation, all of the things where, unfortunately today, if you disaggregate them, you can tell who's who. If I showed you a bar graph and there were two bars and one was here and one was here, and I said, we're talking about wages by gender, you could tell me which one was men, which one was women, right? If I showed you, three bars and we were talking about third grade reading for young men, and I said one bar is Black kids, one bar is Latino kids, one bar is white kids, you could probably tell me who the white kids were. You might go back and forth about, which one was Black, which one was Latino, but you would know. Equity as a goal means we get to a place where you can't tell who's who when you disaggregate data. Equity as a framework for getting to that goal says that if you want to do away with those disparities, then you have to start where the problems are the most intractable, where the disinvestment has been the most over time. And if you start there, and if you solve the problem in the hardest place, then that's a solution that's actually going to benefit everybody. So we take from the work of John Powell and use sort of a targeted universalism approach to our work. If we fix it in the hard place, then everybody's going to benefit from that. Now, and we can go to the next slide. I think part of the point that David is making about REPG and our participation in REPG, and David's obviously has got the history right. Like I've been in it, I think since day one, so that's 20 plus years. My CEO, Sharice West Canterbury, she was one of the people that David was talking about that has gone on to make big impact. She was in it again from day one. So what REPG has done for us over the course of time is it's given us a circle of philanthropic partners that have helped us over time develop both our vocabulary around equity, racial equity, economic equity, but also our strategies around moving an equity agenda, again, particularly in a state like Arkansas, where again, Dr. Murphy Irby, if we had the ability, I might call her up on screen, but she can testify to you that in a state like Arkansas, and there's a question in the chat about what might happen in a Trump administration around DEI and those sorts of things. But in a state like Arkansas, where we have had the state executive use the power of executive order to significantly curtail conversations about the use of the term and certainly strategic actions toward equity. But what we've held on to as a foundation, and this is the one of the values of having a progressive philanthropic structure. What we've held on to is one, we have the right as a foundation to hang on to however we want to talk about our work. Everybody has a First Amendment right, so we've still got that right. But probably more importantly, we've been able to hold on to the theory of change that we use to get to that equity as an outcome. And that's changing the conversation. So we do a lot of narrative work. We do a lot of work helping people understand, that equity doesn't have to be this scary thing, that actually when you get to it, it's actually fairly inclusive at its roots, and it's going to make things better for everybody. So changing the conversation, changing who's in the conversation. And that means that actually what we're after is what sort of folks are trying to undo. What we're after is systems change through public policy, which means that we need to engage more people in public policy conversations. So changing who's in the conversation, and then ultimately changing behavior. And that gets back to, yes, we want to change public policy to change the systems in Arkansas that produce inequitable outcomes that actually harm everybody. And we can go to the next slide. So why do we use an equity framework? And again, I think what I would say, again, for the 60% of the folks that are on the call from nonprofits, is that a lot of what we're saying here is content that you can take back to your funders. At the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and this is foundations in general, people say that philanthropy is maybe the only field in sort of our particularly Western economic framework that doesn't have any natural predators. So the only way that sort of systems have to impact how philanthropy does its work is really through the tax code, is really through IRS. There aren't other places to negatively influence the way that philanthropy operates. The place, though, where philanthropic organizations are positively influenced, and it's really our only constituency, is through our nonprofit partners. So at least once a month in some way, shape, or form, we're pulling together groups of our nonprofit partners, listening to what they say, listening to what they need, and then helping shape our strategy based on what we hear. So it's not sort of out of bounds for I mean, really everybody on this call, but as you're hearing these things, again, to collect them, to engage with your other nonprofit partners, and then, you know, if you're in a particular geography and it's you and you know 6 or 7 other nonprofit partners that are funded by a particular foundation, like it's not out of bounds for all 6 or 7 of you to get together and go to that funder and say, hey, like, here's what we heard about how you can better support us. So the equity framework is just 3 things. It's practical. We don't get to our goals without solving the state's most difficult challenges. And that's for everybody, whether you're an arts funder, whether you're an environmental funder, whether you're an education funder, you got to start with the hard stuff. It's system-centered. Obviously, we believe that the outcomes that people face, again, doesn't really matter what you're talking about, whether it's workforce or education or broadband. We believe that, you know, most of this stuff is a result of systems that just don't work for everybody and work terrible for lots of people. Then those systems have to be changed. And then it's people-centered. The only way that systems change is that people actually get together and decide to change them. And we can go to the next one. And so, you know, for us, and I'll talk about a couple of things that David has already talked about. The convening in Atlanta that he talked about was really this idea that there were a lot of us, and there are people on this webinar from these places, particularly in the South. So Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia for sure, Florida for sure. But there were a lot of us in philanthropy, and it's the same with folks in the nonprofit sector, that were all of a sudden operating in these political contexts that had never been easy, but all of a sudden were extra challenging around equity work, around work that was specific to certain ethnic communities. And one of the things that we could do was bring ourselves together to one, first commiserate and say, yep, feels like that here too. But then secondly, begin to strategize about how we operate in those new spaces. And REPG really actually obviously is serving as an incubator for those conversations. And again, similarly, I think there's room for that sort of incubation fully in the nonprofit sector. I'm not sure, you know, who is doing that, although I do commend Candid. If you scroll through these webinars that Candid is doing and a lot of the writing that they're pushing out, obviously it's focused on the nonprofit sector. It's focusing on helping folks move through these issues successfully. But I do think there's probably more room for that. And then maybe just the other one that I would pull up is it's a collective action hub. We at WRF don't have to go into these conversations by ourselves. That helps me because, and I think this works the same in whether it's in philanthropy or the nonprofit sector, the decisions about what we do relative to equity are these decisions that are informed like in these sort of cross vertical, I guess, silos, right? Staff hears or sees something that they think would be helpful, shares that with senior leadership, that then shares it with the board, the governance function. The governance function says, yay, nay, maybe. The senior leadership function says, got it. Staff function takes that yay, nay, or maybe, and then makes something out of it. It also works the other way sometimes, right? The board or board members see something that may be helpful. They decide at the governance level to say, hey, we should do it this or do it this way. Goes to senior leadership that says, yep, that makes sense, given our strategic direction. Goes to staff to make it happen. But the collective action piece of REPG has always given me sort of first as a staff person and then as a senior leadership person and also as a governance person in several entities, the opportunity to say it's not just us. that there are folks that have done this before. There are folks that have learned good lessons about it, and we can apply those lessons here in our own context. And you can go to the next slide if I've got another one. The last thing maybe I'll lift up, and this is, I think, goes into the raising of the hymn, I think, bucket, is just to double tap on what David talked about around trust-based philanthropy in particular. Hopefully our nonprofit friends that are on the call have either heard this or are experiencing it. But there is a movement, and it was sort of accelerated by COVID, in philanthropy in general, to use more trust-based practices. So if you're not experiencing it, you should be experiencing less onerous reporting requirements. You should be experiencing more general operating support in your grant relationships. You should be experiencing having more questions from your grant making partner about what is best in terms of the work that you're doing. And I also have, if you're not experiencing those things, there's lots of literature out there that you can surreptitiously share with your grant making partner and say, hey, if you're not doing these things, there are other people that have already done them and proven that they actually work better to get you to the outcomes that you want to get to. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Corey. We'll go to Sharmila now.
Thanks, Corey. So just before we wrap up, and I'll try to keep this really brief, just wanted to share a couple resources for all of you that we've identified that could be useful and related to navigating the racial equity backlash and philanthropy. So we have ABFI here. They have the Racial Equity Advancement and Defense Initiative Ready Resource Bank. It's a collaborative effort led by ABFI in partnership with a few other PSOs, and their goal is to help expand and defend race-explicit grant making and programming, and just ensure that equity remains at the forefront of philanthropic efforts. And then we found this webinar from Baker Hostetler and Fairchance. Baker Hostetler is a law firm, and Fairchance is a nonprofit focused on local community-based organizations across communities impacted by racism and discrimination. And they created this webinar. It was actually prior to the Fearless Fund settlement. But it covers things such as the tax law definition of charitable activity and how it affects race-based programs, how Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act applies to nonprofits, what's the difference between a grant and a contract, and how nonprofits and grant makers can best prepare and position themselves to advance racial justice and equity work under the current law. The Racial Equity Tools is a great resource as well. They have a page on countering attacks on racial equity. Common Future, they held a series of roundtables with practitioners, intermediaries, and funders in July of this year, and they're focused on shedding light on the ways to push forward beyond the backlash and in fighting for a multiracial economic democracy. So they have this countering attacks on racial equity page. Oh, sorry, the Racial Backlash Roundtables takeaways page. And then finally, we've linked here the webinar that I referenced, looking at the Fearless Fund settlement, along with a summary document of the foundation from the independent sector, with some resources linked there as well. So encourage you to take a look at those resources. And then finally, here's our contact information. We have also linked here to the REPG page and Winthrop Rockefeller's Foundation's page. And I'm happy to share links. I know there was some some questions in the chat about links to the articles, the Chronicle of Philanthropy and Inside Philanthropy articles. So I'll be happy to share those as a follow-up as well. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you. And I did share all of the links that you shared with us. So just so everyone knows on the call, we're also sending those out. So if we missed anything, any of that, we have 48 hours, and I'll ask the group to just reshare. But everything that you had on your slide, we will share. So thank you. I'm going to start with the question that I have here and then go back to another one, because Sarah said, I may have missed this, but what is the process/commitment for a foundation to join REPG as an affinity member?
Well, at this point in time, my camera's back, people.
So sorry about that technical issue before. So as it relates to what we call affiliate members, our affiliate members at this juncture have been those who have participated in our learning exchange partnership with philanthropy serving organizations. So as we had series of, I mentioned Philanthropy New York and Philanthropy Southeast, and then we had all of those different philanthropy serving organizations that we work with by way of the United Philanthropy Forum, which are multiple. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't create new pathways to bringing in affiliate members. So a lot of this is continually evolving. So if there are people who have that interest and want to explore it further, please let us know. And then, of course, we are also always looking for new members of our core membership. And of course, our core members invest in REPG. That is a big distinction between the affiliates and the core members. The core members financially contribute to REPG and allow us to keep innovating as we do. And so the more members we have and the more resources we can raise in our general pot, the more partnerships we can do with philanthropy serving organizations, the more publications we can do, the more presentations we can do, the more advancing equity series meetings in other parts of the country we can do. So it's the core members like Corey and the others have been so instrumental on so many levels in terms of us being able to build from our, really candid, no pun intended, conversations in our small core group about policies and practices and foundations, the community of practice that Corey referred to really being that incubator of ideas that Corey mentioned, and just helping us to continue to grow and evolve and innovate. And I have to say, I know that there's always concern on the political front, but let's remember it was the challenges that Corey has mentioned at the local level in Southern communities that really influenced our desire to kind of build up intentional strategies to address the current political context. That's why we created the task force on the current political context. And we're building up. We are preparing for whatever challenges come our way. Obviously, with a certain election result, there will be more challenges than if there's another election result. But whatever happens, we will be ready. And we know that so much has been occurring at the local level. And that is one of the reasons why the Advancing Equity series has become such an important part of the work that we're building up for the future.
Thank you. So you kind of answered the other question that I think you may have seen, which is, are you worried that Donald Trump being elected would enact legislation to roll back or eliminate DEI grants? So you're pretty much feeling like preparation is what you're doing for that, just in case. And Corey, did you want to address that as well?
I think so. If anybody else wants to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. I think some of what we did was scenario planning, but honestly, I think when folks get a chance, if you look back at the slides, the things that on the slide that started off where David was talking about building this multiracial democracy, that does and does not have anything to do with the current political context. That is just a thing that needs to happen and needs more consistent, in my words, progressive philanthropic intention over time. regardless of who's president, regardless of what's happening politically, right? So the ideas that I think bubble to the top are just these like universal ideas that we haven't, I think, paid good attention to over time, which allows for these really fraught political sort of social swings, where if we just paid better attention to those things with more intentionality, then we would be less subject to these really wild swings because we would just be stronger as a country in our core.
That's very true. Sharmila, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing I would add is that, the messaging and the narrative might change, but the commitment is still going to be there, right? We're still going to be all these foundations that have made this commitment to racial equity and to these values are going to keep pushing forward on that goal and that this idea of this multiracial democracy. So it doesn't, if things happen, so sure, maybe we need to adjust the language, maybe we need to frame it in a different way. There are ways to kind of get around that, but it's not going to undermine that value and that commitment that these foundations have to this work.
I love that. And that actually leads to this question that Luisa just said. Any advice for nonprofits for how to get on your radar and your members' radar? And I like this question because, again, I think a lot of times we're talking to the foundations that are doing this progressive work and we get excited, but then a lot of nonprofits are still just not getting the funding or able to even meet foundation. So yeah, any advice for how we find these amazing foundations doing this work that feels progressive and what we would like to see more of? I'll let Corey start.
Yeah, I was trying to Google real quick the asker of the question because the first part of my answer is sort of depends on where you are. And I think I think between probably the four of us and maybe other people on call, if we knew where you were and sort of what your focus was, we could probably probably wouldn't take us too long to say, oh, you should talk to such and such. But I think that's part of it. So geographically depends on where you are. It depends on homeless, healthcare, nationwide. So it's a good direct question. Let me take that one on, and I'll find a couple of references for you. How about that?
We love that.
Homelessness is not in my core, but certainly I can do a little bit of digging and ask folks.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And I see Scott in the Q&A. I think it's just giving us brainstorming as free develops for free to students. I think Scott is telling us what organization they are with and giving us all the links and everything else. So that's one way to get on someone's radar. Same thing with Luisa. I think anytime you're in front of any foundations, that's probably one thing you can do is just say, this is who we are, this is what we do, and ask the question. And I like, Corey, that you mentioned, asking your funders to have that kind of relationship with you. You should, David, you mentioned that too, like, foundations should do more than just fund. And maybe people don't feel like they can ask questions or they feel like, there isn't the power, but I think you're giving us permission to do so and telling us that that's okay. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. These are things that we mention as well when we train, but I think it still feels a lot of times to nonprofits that we can't get on the radar. When we have a relationship, it feels like maybe we shouldn't ask certain questions. So I like the framing of, how do we start to ask those questions without like maybe feeling like you're overstepping, overstepping the line or something like that. If you have any more advice like that before we go, we'd love to hear it. And I can start with you, Corey.
Yeah, well, so I have a perspective, like David said, that's sort of informed by a bunch of time I spent at Casey and then time here with my boss. I think that's just our job, right? Like people should be asking us questions. People should be calling us. People should be sending us ideas. Like that's our job. Period. So I would encourage folks to do all of those things.
Okay. And David, any advice from you?
Absolutely. I mean, some of it's been so many years since I worked in a foundation personally, but I can recall people reaching out and having conversations that may or may not have led to a grant, but some of it is really about the match in terms of knowing who to talk to substantively. You know, like Corey just took that pause and said, homelessness is not really my area, but I'll have to look and see. And so some of it is really about knowing who is the right person to talk to. Because when you are working in a substantive area in philanthropy programmatically, it really is, as Corey mentioned, your job to be aware of who's doing the work in that field. So taking a conversation is actually, to a certain degree, to the benefit of the foundation, to learn more about that substantive work. And then, you know, as all of us have talked about in various capacities, by focusing on power sharing and trust-based and collaboration and engagement, part of what we're also doing is breaking down those barriers of communication. And, you know, as somebody who's kind of gone between philanthropy and outside of philanthropy, you know, having had those moments of feeling like, you know, wow, there's this wall here between me and this foundation, because there's this sense that, you know, unless, you know, there is a particular, very specific grant project, you know, directly, we don't have anything to talk about. I think we need to, I hope what we're doing in our work when we talk about power sharing and we talk about trust base is that we're also transforming the culture of philanthropy and breaking down those power dynamics where it's not about, well, you can talk to me and you can't. And it is more a level of engagement both ways. And hopefully that's what we're contributing to building.
Absolutely. Thank you. That is a good mic drop moment. Thank you so much, Sharmila, Corey, David, for being here today, and our audience as well. And if you like this webinar, I hope you join us for another one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just want to say bye, and hopefully we'll see you again doing this great work.
Thank
All
you
right.
all for joining. Thanks, Yvonne.
Bye, all.